I am so pleased to introduce Alan Jones, Professor of Bible at Corban University. He will be presenting today on the narratorial perspective in Ezra-Nehemiah.
The advantage of being able to plan the schedule of something like this is to plan yourself right after lunch. So you all were supposed to be somewhere at a restaurant or in the cafeteria right now. So I will assume this is a mistake, but may God have mercy on your souls. I do want to say thank you. Thank you for coming to this session. Thank you for coming today. You all being here is the thing that we actually wanted, was to have people come and enjoy Ray, enjoy the things that Ray has been about for so long. So really, just a thank you to all of you. And to start my paper, to begin, I want to start with my own thanks. The work that I'm presenting here today has a direct connection to a conversation I had with Ray on Ezra-Nehemiah some 20 years ago when I was an undergraduate at Multnomah. Then as an undergraduate now, and now as a professor in biblical studies, if you don't know Ray, Ray has a way of shaping your thoughts and remaining connected to your life. And I find myself deeply grateful for the place that he plays in my life. I would also say that the paper you're about to hear is the beginning work on a project that landed in my lap. I'm starting to work on Ezra-Nehemiah, which is not my book, but I've always had interest in it. Particularly because, as the Word of God, it's an interesting book where God does not talk. If this is the Word of God, to have somebody else speaking for him raises the question, is this the voice of God, or is it not? Particularly in my community, when this book has been used as justification to separate away from and to draw back from and to exclude certain peoples as a theological extension of the book of Ezra-Nehemiah. Ray is the person that pushed deep into you. Always be attentive to the text, be attentive to what it gives you, and then, and only then, start to make your conclusions off of those things. So turning to this paper then, there will be two distinct phases in what follows. First, I will examine the narratorial voice in Ezra-Nehemiah as a unique construction within Hebrew Bible. Put simply, as I said, God never speaks in Ezra-Nehemiah. So it is characters, three characters, the distinct narrators mostly, who will have to speak for him. Thus, in what follows, I will document all attributions of divine activity from any party in the story, but the paper will focus primarily on what we call the classical third-person narrator, that is the familiar God's eye view agent that we're so used to, that leads the reader through a story. But I will also pay attention to two first-person narrations, those of Ezra and Nehemiah, as these three people give us the majority of statements on God and his character in the book. Second, having highlighted the distinctive narratorial profile of Ezra-Nehemiah, I will consider how the story's construction may actually serve to undermine the reader's confidence in the characters, Ezra and Nehemiah, and their efforts to establish the return community according to their vision for the people. So, Ezra chapters 1 through 6. Looking over the events in Ezra 1 through 6, there is a discernible story arc. Cyrus, the king of Persia, frees the captive Judeans in Babylon, who return to Jerusalem to begin work on the temple, that is chapters 1 through 3. The work faces disruptions, but eventually it finds its completion, and the returnees celebrate Passover in chapters 4 through 6. Per our interests, a variety of figures give reference to or speak for God across this section. In chapter 1, the classical narrator opens the story for us. The classical narrator opens by stating, to fulfill the word of Adonai from Jeremiah, Adonai roused the spirit of Cyrus, the Persian king, verse 1. This manifests in royal decrees, verses 2 through 4, wherein Cyrus speaks for Adonai himself, claiming he, Adonai, has given him, Cyrus, dominion and has appointed him to build a house for Adonai back in Jerusalem. Then, as a compliment, the narrator steps in and notes, Adonai also roused to action the spirits of the Judahite, the Benjamite, the priestly, and the Levitical leaders, all in verse 5. Moving forward, in Ezra 3, the narrator does not speak directly for God, but he does designate the returnees' actions, that is, instituting the regular sacrifices and observing Sukkot, as according with God's Torah or his ordinance, verses 2 through 4. This then establishes God's voice through an authoritative proxy, as the reference to Jeremiah's word did back in chapter 1. When the returnees moved to work on the foundations of the temple in Ezra 3:10, the community itself speaks for God, saying, "Surely he is good, for his everlasting chesed is upon Israel," and leaving their chesed having a number of nuances, either love, loyalty, community faithfulness, anything that it is, God gives that to Israel. Verse 11. Finally, in Ezra 5, the narrator reports Haggai and Zechariah prophesied in God's name, who we know from the biblical books Haggai and Zechariah, verse 1, and they supported a reinitiated building effort, that is in verse 2. This elicits renewed opposition from local officials, verses 3 and 4, but the narrator states God's eye was upon the returnees, verse 5. We can have faith. And for their part, the returnees declare they are the servants of God, though it was their forefathers who had angered God and brought on their punishment, that is, the exile, verses 11 through 12. The narrator then states in chapter 6, the people had succeeded in building through the support of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah. They had their desired effect. They had built by reason of the decree of God and the decree of the Persian emperors, verse 14, coordinating both divine and human activity. Further, having organized the priests and the Levites according to the book of Moses, there is our authoritative proxy again, scriptural reference, verse 18. The returnees performed the feast of unleavened bread, expressly because Adonai had inclined the heart of the king, that is the Persian king, toward the work of the temple, verse 22, thereby bringing this section to its denouement. All of the story is pushing towards the combination of human and divine activity. Moving then into Ezra 7 through 10. In Ezra 7 through 10, Ezra enters the narrative, beginning in Babylon and leading a cohort of returnees to Jerusalem, just as his predecessors had done. We've begun this cyclical activity. However, unlike the earlier characters, Ezra does not pursue a building project. Rather, he spends his time confronting returnees who have married non-Judeans and attempting to dissolve these unions. Further, per the interests of this paper, I would also note this is the first section wherein the story's narration shifts. Through the first major section, you follow the God's eye view above the story. All of a sudden, chapter 7, you're going to slam down to the earth level and watch this occur through the eyes of a person, through Ezra. The classical narrator stands in Ezra chapter 7, 1 through 26, but at verse 27, Ezra takes over the role. He grabs the microphone for the next two chapters. For his part, the classical narrator informs the reader that, 1, Ezra is a scribe and he is skilled in Adonai's Torah. This is given through Moses, verse 6. 2, Ezra is one on whom Adonai has his hand, and this is manifest as favor from the king, also in verse 6. And 3, Ezra's safe return to Jerusalem traces back to that God's hand upon Ezra, verse 9. Once Ezra becomes narrator in Ezra 7:27, he, Ezra, makes additional claims about God's activities and inclinations, some that align with the classical narrator's comments, and others that go beyond them. Whether or not they contradict them, we will have to decide. Ezra states that Adonai put it on the king's heart, the Persian king's heart, to resource the temple, Ezra 7:27, and that he, Adonai, inclined the king toward himself such that he, Ezra, would then strengthen himself, Ezra 7:28. Further, Ezra states that God supported him when forming his caravan, Ezra 8:18, and that his hand was upon him to give safe passage back to Jerusalem, Ezra 8:31. The confluence of the narrator's commentary and Ezra's own perspective is in alignment. However, going beyond the traditional narrator's claims, Ezra also includes that he was ashamed to ask the king for military support for his journey, as he and his compatriots had already told the king God's hand is on those who seek him. That's what we should expect. Whereas his strength and his anger are on those who abandon him, Ezra 8:22. Apparently, in Ezra's perspective, to have requested help from the king is also to reject God. Yet, with fasting and seeking God, Ezra states confidently, God, he was supplicated on this matter. Ezra 8:23. Therefore, safe passage back to Jerusalem should have been predictable. It was predictable. Moving forward to chapter 9. This is the so-called mixed marriage crisis. Ezra contrasts God's actions with what he deems to be the community's betrayal. In a prayer of confession, Ezra affirms it was Adonai's grace to leave a remnant after the exile, specifically and possibly exclusively, that is, those who had returned from Babylon, Ezra 9:8 and 13. And if you had the opportunity to be here for Dr. Stromberg's paper, this question becomes a live question. What is the people of God? Is it those who are left in the land after the judgment has come and survive as a remnant and as a people to repopulate and to grow? Or is the remnant the people that get purged and get refined by fire in the exile and then get to claim the real mantle of being the people of God? According to Ezra, the remnant is those who have experienced Babylon. As opposed to those who remain? The question is live. And that he, that is God, had extended them, the exiles, who have come to repopulate and to be the holy people, he extended them chesed before the Persian kings, Ezra 9:9. Yet now the community had abandoned God's commands, Ezra 9:10, which Ezra asserts must surely anger God to the point of destroying the returnees, Ezra 9:14. Following the prayer, the classical narrator re-enters the story at chapter 10, but he makes no further claims regarding God in the book of Ezra. Rather, to close the crisis, it is Shechaniah, a supporter of Ezra. It is he who states that a compulsory divorce policy is what is in accordance with Torah, what Torah requires, verse 3. It is Ezra who says, it is Adonai's will that the returnees separate from the peoples of the land and their nashim nochriot. And we leave this untranslated because it has a number of nuance. Nashim nochriot can be foreign women, but nashim nochriot can also be different women. It can also be women that don't tend to align. So who exactly is it that they're intermixing with? The text is ambiguous. Verse 11. It is the returnees that assert by implementing Ezra's policy, they are turning away God's burning anger. Verse 14. Interestingly, the chapter then closes with a list of guilty parties, but the narrative is surprisingly ambiguous as to whether or not the community implemented its divorce policy. There is no run out in the narrative in this particular arc. Then we move on to Nehemiah 1 through 13. Finally, moving into Nehemiah, it is obvious brevity will be essential. I have 13 chapters to cover in about 5.5 minutes. Every preacher's dream. I will forego a digest. Hopefully, we are all familiar with Nehemiah's wall. And further, I will offer only a summary listing of a number of references to or claims on God in this particular section. That all said, as the traditional narrator makes no direct claim on God in Nehemiah, as Nehemiah dominates narration across the book of Nehemiah, it's his voice in all of chapters 1 through 7. It's his voice across chapter 13. There's only a small block where the third-person narrator will return and be the guide. And as many of the section's references to God are akin to earlier references, hopefully you will allow me this. Beginning with Nehemiah. In chapters 1 through 7, Nehemiah asserts that Adonai, or God, had had his good hand on him, specifically regarding this wall building project. Nehemiah 2:7 through 8 and 18. So again, we're getting references to God's hand. We've seen this happen before. Nehemiah claims that Adonai, or God, had inclined his, this is Nehemiah's, heart toward the project. Nehemiah 2:12 and 7:5. Again, the divine leading a human agent, but now the human agent claiming that mantle. And that Adonai, or God, would grant success to or protection for the project in the future. Nehemiah 2:20 and 4:14. The mirroring of the attribution to God of numbers of activities is in line. but the person making the claim has shifted at this point. Additionally, both the community and Nehemiah attribute particular matters to God's doing. The community, citing their subjugation to foreign kings, Nehemiah 9:37, which harkens back to chapters 1 through 6, when the community says, "We are the ones that had angered God." Nehemiah, for his part, cites the joy-filled atmosphere of the wall dedication. That's Nehemiah 12:43. Again, humans attributing to God's agency. Last, both the classical narrator and Nehemiah associate community actions with Torah obedience. This is indirect attribution, that authoritative proxy of Scripture, similarly to what we saw in those earlier sections. The narrator cites the celebration of Sukkot as in accordance with Torah or the command, Nehemiah 8:13 through 18. And Nehemiah cites both the collection of firstfruits and tithes, Nehemiah 12:44, as well as the decision to exclude all that is foreign as in accordance with Torah or the book of Moses, Nehemiah 13:1 through 3. Turning then to the unique ways in which characters engage God in Nehemiah, 2 points are apparent. First, in Nehemiah, both Nehemiah and the communities begin issuing directives to God. They start telling God what to do. In chapter 1, Nehemiah employs what we call jussives, expressions of desire, 2 jussives, and 3 actual command statements. But there are 4 what we call na particles. They're particles of entreaty, particles of softening. So, do this, please, is how we would translate. Imploring Adonai to let his ears and eyes be attentive, to remember his words, these are Adonai's words, to his people, and to grant him, that is Nehemiah, success and compassion before the Persian king, verses 6, 8, and 11. This is nothing wrong. We've seen God give favor to a number of characters before the Persian kings. In chapter 3, 5, and 6, Nehemiah encounters opposition in Jerusalem, and he, 1, commands God to remember his, Nehemiah's, charges against his adversaries outside the community. This is Nehemiah 3, 36 through 37. 2, he commands God to shake off those within the community, anybody who won't listen to him, and that is Nehemiah. There's lost. Okay, inside the community, those who don't listen to him, and to remember the good he, Nehemiah, has done for the people. Nehemiah 5, 13, and 19. And 3rd, he commands God to strengthen his hand, that is Nehemiah's hand, and remember the deeds of those who were trying to terrify Nehemiah. Nehemiah 6, 9, and 14. In chapter 9, the community expresses their own wish in their prayer of confession that God would not let their hardship seem small before him. Verse 32, they are still a vassal. They are still occupied by a foreign power. And finally, in chapter 13, Nehemiah issues God 6 more commands. He's efficient in his final chapter. He commands God to remember him and not wipe out his, Nehemiah's, chesed. Nehemiah has chesed. Verse 14. He commands God to remember him and have pity according to his, God's, chesed. For him, Nehemiah. Verse 22. He commands God to remember his opponents and their defilement of the priesthood, verses 28 and 29. And he commands God to remember him, Nehemiah, for good, verse 31. But not the good he has done, but to remember good that God owes to Nehemiah. Second, Nehemiah also distinguishes himself as he makes statements about other characters and designates their knowledge as knowledge of God's workings. Now he's in the minds of other characters. In chapter 4, having thwarted a supposed conspiracy among his enemies, Nehemiah declares, these figures knew it was God who had frustrated their plans. Verse 9. And in chapter 6, upon completion of the wall, Nehemiah asserts that his enemies knew this work. It had been done by God. Verse 16. So, what can we do with these kinds of observations? Simple paying attention to the text. In the time remaining, I will forward 3 insights for consideration based on these observations. First, I would highlight what we call the coordination of rising ambiguity in Ezra-Nehemiah with the transfer of the narratorial role from the classical narrator over to the characters Ezra and Nehemiah. In Ezra 1 through 6, there is a clear end to the returnee's task and a reliable narratorial voice guiding the reader. This is very familiar in Hebrew Bible. Through the narrator, Adonai calls his people out of exile and back to religious observance. And the narrative, the actual story, and the narrator, the guide for the story, they both confirm this undertaking is accomplished. The returnees complete the temple, and the narrator confirms this is through God's support. Though it is notable that this moment, this concluding moment in chapters 1 through 6, it comes without a filling event, as we see with the tabernacle and Solomon's temple. You complete the tabernacle, God's presence comes. You complete the temple, God's presence comes. We complete the second temple, and the story's quiet. The story never says that the glory did not come. The story just never tells you that it did come. There. In Ezra 7 through 10, the classical narrator's opening comments provide a strong frame for Ezra. But that intermarriage crisis grounding the conflict, that's Ezra's discovery. And the ark is missing two constitutive elements. First, beyond the marriages themselves, it is quite hard to find any Torah violation among the people that might validate this furor. Second, there is no strong conclusion tying off the matter. We are told in the marriage moment, the leaders come to Ezra and they say, it's terrible. They've married these women. And the construction is not they have married women from these nations. It's they've married women, and these women do things that are like the people that we see over in those places. So you don't actually know who it is they've married, but you know somebody thinks what they do is wrong. And we do know the wrong things that they do. So what would you expect? I don't know, somebody bowing down to an idol? Somebody violating some sort of Torah law? You'd expect confirmation. If they're true and reliable, show me the evidence. And the story doesn't give it to us. Doesn't mean that it didn't happen, just as the story doesn't tell us it does happen. This is interesting. The reader is aware that Ezra sees the marriages themselves as a problem, but the narrative lacks a clear resolution by which one can judge the appropriateness of this intervention. The reader is left on their own. Last, while Nehemiah's task is clear from the beginning, and while he does complete his wall, the closing scene in Nehemiah 13 significantly undermines his efforts. If his goal was to transition the community from being an exposed and vulnerable people to being a secure and separated people, well, then the Gentile living at the temple, verses 1 through 9, the trade taking place on Sabbath, the foreign people who want to come and do commerce, on verses 15 and 22, and the continuing relationships with foreign women, in verses 23 to 27, they indicate that the wall has not been very effective. Thus, for whatever one will make of it, we can say the retreat of the classical narrator also maps closely onto the narrative's retreat from certainty and its foregrounding of ambiguity related to the characters and their work. Second, the complex combination of classical third-person omniscient narration with first-person point-of-view narration in Ezra-Nehemiah, it requires further exploration. Ezra 1 through 6 presents as that typical Hebrew Bible narrative. The narrator is all-knowing, the characters speak in line with the narrator, and the plot goes according to plan. However, when Ezra becomes narrator in Ezra 7 through 10, questions start to arise. If the classical narrator and Ezra agree that Adonai's hand is on Ezra, and if they agree that the Persian king is participating in Adonai's actions because he recognizes Ezra's unique status, then one wonders, why does Ezra refuse an escort? On what grounds does he conclude that to accept royal assistance is tantamount to abandoning God, particularly as we already know Adonai is currently acting through the king? Further, while the speeches in Ezra 9 demonstrate Ezra is ready with Torah, one might wonder about his innovative uses. His language is clearly Deuteronomic, but it is also clear he is drawing together a number of disparate texts, and when he does, he expands on them beyond a plain reading of those texts, particularly when accepting that Torah says you must divorce these women. Certainly, he begs the question. Most troubling of all, though, is Nehemiah. With no outside introduction, the reader has nothing but Nehemiah's words and actions by which to appraise him. Thus, when Nehemiah claims God's hand is on him, and this manifests in royal letters, army officers, and mounted horsemen ensuring his return, we immediately think of Ezra. Has Nehemiah just abandoned God by receiving help from the king? Or was it Ezra who was off base? Consternation enters. Further, when Nehemiah attributes perspectives to his opponents, framing their appreciation of observable facts as acceptance that this is God's work, that he is inside their head, we realize Nehemiah's narration is Nehemiah's opinion in these places. And if so here, perhaps also beyond? Last, as Nehemiah leans into his propensity to issue God commands, there is a dual effect on the reader. He noticeably steps away from the story as guide and engages directly with God in these moments, which turns us, the reader, into a spectator on his behavior. Certainly, there are other figures in Hebrew Bible who issue God commands. But the reader of Nehemiah is acutely aware, this moment, it's not for me. Nehemiah and God, they're working something out right now. But this only foregrounds for the reader the lack of narrative fulfillment one observes within the story. Nowhere does God respond to Nehemiah's demands within the book so as to indicate he is justified, that he agrees with Nehemiah about these particular points. If Nehemiah 13 is any indication, Nehemiah's wall has not set a boundary around the community, and Nehemiah appears resigned to demanding that God give him credit at least for his efforts. Yet, as Nehemiah's credentials are potentially in question, and as no outside voice validates him, we begin to wonder, are his demands even reasonable? To close it off, in Ezra-Nehemiah, it seems the reader is left with uncertainty, but possibly intentionally. Much of the story lacks closure, but perhaps Ezra and Nehemiah are trustworthy. Perhaps they offer a strong paradigm for leaving exile and emerging as the people of God, even if the process gets messy. Life is messy. This happens. Alternatively, perhaps Ezra and Nehemiah are not so reliable. Perhaps they're sincere, but to be cautious, perhaps they're not speaking for God right now. There's little outside their own claims confirming that they do. And it is this very sense of uncertainty that leads us as readers to go back and wonder about their program. Perhaps in the end, ambiguity, both for the characters and especially for the reader, is a feature of Ezra-Nehemiah and not a bug. Thank you for your time.
So we will take time for at least one question. The most popular we have is, are there any places you can point to in the reception history of Ezra and Nehemiah that follows a similar reading to yours and is suspicious of Ezra and Nehemiah?
That is actually why I became interested in this. This particular project I'm set on is supposed to take biblical texts and then look at them into reception history. So that's the next phase. So if any of you have any inklings of people who are receiving Ezra and Nehemiah, my impression, and it is a very, very early impression, is that in Second Temple literature, people end up being a little cautious with Ezra. He ends up playing in a number of places. But there are places in which he does things, and all of a sudden you start reading around like, is that exactly what he's supposed to be doing? Why is he talking against the way he seems to be talking in Ezra right now? Whereas he is nervous about joy-filled responses to Torah and those sort of things, back in Ezra, they're like, no, stop wailing, stop weeping. Like, we need to be like positive about this. With Ezra, all of a sudden, he's not quite as sure. He's not quite as confident of a character. So I don't know, as far as the reception history goes. It's the next phase in the project. But if that's your question, or you voted up and you know something, I'd love to hear.
One more. We'll do, how are Nehemiah's directives to God different from other places in the Hebrew Bible where prominent characters give God directives with no critique?
None. There is no difference. And that's part of the point. As you're watching this happen, you're realizing this is okay. Like, it is okay to engage with God in this way. If you're reading a narrative and somebody wants to indicate to you, and this is the way this should go, you have some sort of run out to it. You find out they issue the command, and then it's received, and then it's fulfilled, and it's okay. In Ezra and Nehemiah, we just don't have that. So it's not that it's not good. It's not that it's all bad. It's that you're left wondering. If somebody wanted to go ahead and cap off these narratives, it seems like it should have been possible to do so. Why include Nehemiah 13? Why not just leave it? Why not just stop at 12? It would have been a great conclusion if you were very satisfied with Nehemiah as a character. But instead we have 13, and it just throws us back into ambiguity. It's not wrong to say these things to God. The question is this particular command the thing that God was asking for?
All right. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.